Hi, friends. Welcome to the latest episode of the Gradient Podcast, where we interview various people who research, build, or use AI, including academics, engineers, artists, entrepreneurs, and more. I am your host, Daniel Bashir. Today's guest is truly one of the greats. I am very excited to share this interview with Professor Yoshua Bengio. If you're in the AI space, then Yoshua Bengio hardly needs an introduction, but here is one anyway. He is a full professor at the University de Montreal, as well as founder and scientific director of both the Mila Quebec AI Institute and the Avado Institute. Best known for his work in pioneering deep learning, Professor Bengio was one of three awardees of the 2018 AM Turing Award, along with Geoffrey Hinton and Yann LeCun. He is also the awardee of the prestigious Killam Prize, and as of this year, the computer scientist with the highest H index in the world. This was an expansive episode. I think there was almost too much that I wanted to speak to Professor Bengio about. And I think the episode will certainly betray that I was a little bit nervous talking to a researcher of such high stature. Nevertheless, I found this to be a really valuable and interesting conversation. Professor Bengio is a very thoughtful and admirable human being. I appreciate his patience with the flurry of questions I had spanning most of his career, and I hope you find the conversation interesting. And with all that, let's move on to the episode. So, without further ado, Yoshua Bengio. Professor Bengio, you have told your story of getting into deep learning a number of times, I think. And so in formulating this particular question, there's one thing I'd love for you to focus on. And in particular, you've mentioned the influence of the PDP group, for instance, and Geoffrey Hinton on your early thinking. I'd love for you to linger on and expand on that a little bit in terms of your driving into the deep learning realm.
Yeah, it was kind of a revelation when I read the PDP book, and actually, it's a book. There are two tomes, and they're both worth rereading almost 30 years later. And yeah, I wasn't sure what I would do for my grad studies, and so it was a turning point. And these two tomes actually, one has more of a sort of computer science flavor, or like more of a AI flavor, if you want, and the other is more psychological and cog-sci flavor and neuroscience flavor. And for me, that was important too. I didn't know anything about neuroscience before reading that stuff, but it gave me really a strong. I realized, I cared about understanding how our brain works and how come we are intelligent beyond the, nicety of being able to build more intelligent machines. So it's an emotional thing. I think when I was younger, I was always asking myself about, what is intelligence? And I didn't realize that we could actually study it scientifically because I didn't know much biology. I was a computer scientist. And in retrospect, it turns out that this way of paying attention to the biology of intelligence has guided a lot of my work throughout all the past decades and continues to do. My current work is very driven by trying to fit what I see as the teachings from what we know about brains.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there's like an argument why this is important that is a little bit abstract and technical for AI. One way to think about this is the space of possible algorithms that we could design for AI is just huge. And the space of algorithms is huge anyways. And what we're doing as scientists in AI is searching that space and seeing what works and maybe using our math and other tools to help in that process. But when we bring in the knowledge about how animal and human intelligence works, to the extent that we have some knowledge, it reduces that search space considerably. And so I think it's one of the reasons why I've been so successful in my research, because I kind of forced myself into trying to be consistent with some of the things I knew from biology.
Mm. Yeah, it does seem like biology and a lot of ideas, for example, I suppose the way children learn and acquire language and all of that do often get invoked as guiding principles. And I guess not just the construction and looking through the search space, but then also evaluating how are we actually doing in terms of measuring the performance of the systems we're building.
Yeah, at the same time, I need to say that a lot of neuroscientists may think that my work and the work of other people like Geoff Hinton doesn't qualify as really strongly constrained by biology, and they're right, because, and we use the word inspired by biology, because it's much better if we understand what we're doing. So if we just copy details that are in brains, but we don't understand why they would make sense, usually we go nowhere. So it's more an inspiration, but we try to make sense of why that inspiration, what a particular aspect of biology could be important.
Mm, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I'm curious about in particular too is since you had mentioned not exactly being sure what you wanted to do in your PhD and PDB being more or less an inspiration for you, was there was that moment at all a shift in terms of what you thought the foundations of AI should look like, or did you feel like that encounter just articulated something that might have already been in your head?
I think the mental construction of what we need for AI and so on is something that came slowly with maturation and years after I decided to go this way. So I guess I just followed my intuition initially without having a strong argument in my head. But it built up over the years, thanks to also discussing with lots of my peers, of course.
Right, right. So, following this encounter throughout your PhD, your thesis, you worked on artificial neural networks and applying them to sequence recognition, and you were on the paper with Jan LeCun, gradient-based learning applied to document recognition.
Right,
Could
right.
you tell me a little bit about working with LeCun? I understand that you did a postdoc with him and Larry Jackal at AT&T Bell Labs, and then this paper came out after that.
That's right. That's right. So when I arrived at Bell Labs, I met an amazing group of researchers, including folks like Leon Boutou, for example. I met Bernard Schopkopf, who's now working with me. Along similar lines. He inspired me on things causality these days. Vladimir Vapnik, Isabelle Guyon, Jan, of course, and several others. And Jan is an incredibly smart and intuitive person,
Mm.
and he's much calmer than I am. I'm kind of maybe more of a sort of excited, enthusiastic person, and he's more laid back. So we had lots of discussions, and I learned a lot from him and the group. Also, he started playing more of a managerial role, and he was very good at that. So he continued in that direction later, and that taught me as well something that served when I became myself faculty and had a group of students. He gave us and Larry as well, Larry Jackal, they both gave me a lot of freedom. This is something that I do with my students, and you have to let go a little bit, right? Because there's a temptation to, oh, you do this, you do that. But really, these grad students, they come with their own spirit, and the way I try to present it is, well, let's talk about things that are of mutual interest, that we both find interesting. So there is freedom, but we also want to have a discussion where both parties are interested. So yeah, so he helped me build a sense of how one could have a group of researchers that are not just individuals, but working together towards common goals, but also where each person has its own mind and its own views. And we had in this group people working on kernel machines and people working on neural nets, which a few years later were kind of a bit of an opposition, let's say. But it went really well at that time.
That strikes me as something like a collective social intelligence, right? Presumably, a bunch of people are in the same lab because they have some shared sense of goals or some broad research program they'd like to achieve. But the different people in that group are, of course, going to have very different ideas, perhaps, about how to actually go about that. And then it's like, yes, we share this high, broad set of interests, but then as an advisor, you want to make sure that people have that ability to explore their different thoughts and how to actually get there.
Yes. You have to realize that scientific research is an exploration. And as such, as we learn when we do machine learning, like in reinforcement learning, it is necessary to take risks and to explore many paths. And that's what the scientific community does. You have different people and they all think, they know better where to go. And that's fine. That's what allows us to be efficient by, investing in many directions that are promising. And we don't know ahead of time who's going to be right. That's why we need that exploration in the first place.
Yeah, that's certainly really valuable. And I suppose there's sometimes it feels like there's an incentive to notice, oh, this line of research is working really well, and then double down the investment and everything like that. And that's good for the people working in that area. And I suppose those who are excited, but then not leaving enough room for that exploration certainly has a lot of drawbacks as well. The next, I guess, time period of your research that you tend to focus on is uncovering the fundamental difficulty of learning in recurrent nets. And I thought that the learning long-term dependencies with gradient descent is difficult was a really interesting paper. I thought it was kind of a paradigmatic case of, I know that you talk about taking a sort of large research problem and sort of distilling it down into its fundamental components. And this was very much something that you did with this paper in terms of looking at the condition required to store bits of information.
It's the result of banging my head on hard walls for a few years because I was working on recurrent nets and sometimes it really didn't work. And so I think the question people should ask themselves when things don't work is, there's an opportunity. What's the problem? Let's try to understand. Ask the why questions rather than just let's make it work or let's make it beat the benchmark.
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity there to dig into what's the fundamental phenomenon happening here, as opposed to thinking of it in the framework of let's hack around this, I suppose, and do the more leaderboard chasing style approach.
Yes. And I think in machine learning in general, there's too much of the culture of let's just build a system that works really well and beats the other algorithms instead of let's try to understand. And so people don't spend a lot of time on negative results. One thing that's particular about this paper is it's essentially a negative result.
Mm-hmm.
It says there's a big problem with recurrent nets and a wider class of learning machines. And what is the problem? So, really digging into fundamentally what is going on and doing experiments whose purpose was not to compare algorithm A with algorithm B, but really answer the questions of, what's the hypothesis and can we test it? And the nice thing is when you do that, you can reduce the problem. You don't have to have a big system that takes forever to train. We can reduce it. In our case, we reduced it to like single recurrent neuron. That was enough to really understand what was going on. And of course, then you want to make sure that the theory generalizes, which we did by talking about dynamical systems and tractors and things like that.
That was one of the things I really liked about this paper. I know that when I was first introduced to the idea of recurrent neural nets and saw the comparisons between those and LSTMs and things like that, I was given this high level idea you might get things like vanishing gradient problems when you look over long time spans. But there wasn't much deeper than that. And when I went through this paper, I thought that the articulation in terms of attractors and looking at characterizing whether dynamics are attractive or not with the spectral radius was really interesting, and I think gave a good sort of deeper lens into what's actually going on under the hood.
Yeah. In retrospect, I think it was one of my best papers. It didn't get as much, publicity as others, but I think it was a very important piece of contribution.
You have mentioned in at least one interview that you feel people don't understand this work well enough. And do you think it's that dynamical systems articulation of it, or could you tell me a little bit
Yeah,
more about that feeling?
yeah, exactly. Just the story you told. So people understand you multiply a bunch of gradients together and it gets small. But and by the way, that idea had been put before our work, and I didn't know about it because it was in a German master thesis um, by sorry, what's his name? Anyways, um, but the attractor thing is something people have trouble with because it's not something we learn in typically in computer science, and it's a really important notion in mathematics, and it turns out to be important in my current work, thinking about how the brain does things. I think this is something that would be worth teaching more as well, like these notions of dynamics and attractors to understand neural nets and their capabilities.
Certainly. It was definitely not something that I was taught as a part of my CS program, and it definitely took me a little bit to come to grips with what was going on there. But I did feel like that was a very nice and helpful way of articulating what was going on. I can definitely agree that it would be nice to have that more in traditional CS programs. The the next stage of your work I'd love to talk about is looking at word embeddings from neural networks and neural language models. There is a lot of important work here, and a lot of it has to do with trying to bypass the curse of dimensionality. And you articulate this in a neural probabilistic language model. You introduce word embeddings as part of a neural network that models language data, and then also introduced this idea of asynchronous SGD. Could you tell me just a little bit about what your experience was like working on the paper at the time and sort of figuring out this curse of dimensionality issue?
So the curse of dimensionality idea is something that actually arose just a couple of years before in work I did with my brother. There's like a Benjio and Benjio paper on how neural nets can potentially bypass the curse of dimensionality that occurs in learning joint distribution over discrete variables. So that was not language, but think about discrete data, which at that time was mostly modeled by tables, counts, frequencies. And of course that blows, that doesn't scale if you have many variables. That's the curse of dimensionality here. And we had a paper that showed, I think even in Europe, that if you use a neural net to learn conditional distributions to decompose the joint, and that there is a structure that a neural net can capture, then you're not suffering from the curse of dimensionality. And then the language model paper was kind of an application of this, but where we introduced an idea that actually came from Geoff Hinton, that words should be represented, or symbols. I mean, he was thinking about symbols. Symbols should be represented by vectors. That was already like part of his mantra in the late 80s in his paper on distributed representations. And then applying these ideas in the context of language modeling, showing that, not just numerically, but showing like intuitively why we can bypass the curse of dimensionality. It's because words have shared attributes and meaning, so that cat and dog can replace each other in a sentence, because there is a sort of semantic representation that maybe that's hidden to us, and that's actually present in our brain, in which they share a lot of attributes because they're pets, right? Common pets, and that allows, if you understand this and you see how now we don't need to see all the possible sequences of words in order to generalize. You can take advantage of that similarity between words. And that's the first order thing. And then you can have more complicated nonlinearities. That's where the neural net part comes in.
That makes a lot of sense. One thing that stuck out to me in this paper, you had some interesting suggestions for future work. And one of these was introducing a priori knowledge, that was to say semantic information, like low and high level grammatical information, coupling the model to a stochastic grammar, things like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
And I guess today the way NLP seems to have gone, not so much into introducing a priori knowledge, but I'm curious how you look back at those words now.
Well, I'm working on things currently that go in that direction.
Right.
Maybe we didn't have the tools to handle efficiently and in a rich way the kind of latent structure that, say, a parse or a semantic parse, which is really what we care about, could be discovered by neural nets and could be represented in a way that exploits the sparse dependencies that exist at that level. So when you look at the word level, you basically need to look at all the previous words to predict the next word. So you need a lot of data. That's why we need like huge data sets to train, with huge corpora to train these large language models. But if you can represent things at a more abstract level, thinking about the relationships between words that take meaning together, like subject, verb, object of particular kinds, you don't need as much data because the relationships are simpler. They involve fewer concepts, and a lot of my recent work on trying to bring in high-level cognition into neural nets is motivated by this idea that we can put in more inductive biases, more structure that will reduce the sample complexity of language models, but potentially more, like, and be able to do things like reasoning better.
I do think one of those perennial questions is always, what is the right granularity of the inductive prior to introduce to the system? And I do want to dive into your thoughts on these priors from higher level cognition. But first, I'd love to take a little bit of a tour through the rise of deep learning era. Could you tell me a bit about your experience of that period, what that was like for you?
So there are different phases. So there's this phase where I'm feeling that the field is moving away from neural nets. My students are, want to work on kernel machines and stuff like that. And that's the time when I write the neural language model paper. And so a lot of what I did in these early years of like the deep learning era is trying to understand what neural nets could bring that was missing in other approaches. So this curse of dimensionality question, I worked a lot on the curse of dimensionality. So is there an issue with lots of the kernel methods or the graphical models that were based on tables that were popular in those days? So it was more like trying to save the neural nets because people seem to have thrown the baby with the bathwater. and I thought there was something important we were missing though. And so that's one aspect. And then really a big player then was Geoff Hinton. He came up with the RBM, the restricted Boltzmann machine, and discussions with him shifted my view about unsupervised learning. So I used to be with the paper with Yann LeCun, for example, on document recognition, I was fully into the supervised end-to-end learning mantra. And these discussions with Geoff really helped me understand the importance of unsupervised representation learning. And by the way, in the first decade of deep learning, let's say until 2015 roughly, people didn't pay much attention to unsupervised learning. In fact, it's only since the transformer era that the majority of researchers in machine learning realized how useful unsupervised learning was, because this is the unsupervised pre-training, which was introduced in those early years with layers, stacks of RBMs and stacks of autoencoders, and then the denoising autoencoder. And by the way, the denoising autoencoder is behind, which is essentially due to Pascal Vincent, who was my student and then became a faculty. Is behind is the main recipe behind the unsupervised representation learning we find in modern language learning model. And with the masking idea and reconstruction ideas. So unsupervised learning became big for me, and it still is. But it was a big shift for me. And I continue in that direction, and sort of my modern undertakings, because humans get very little actual supervision. We get feedback. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, this is a cat," but you usually don't get that.
Yeah, it is. It is kind of amazing just the way in which human children are able to pick up on things like the complex structure of language, for instance. And it does seem like there's very little actual direction in how that occurs. So it does seem a little bit of a mystery, at least what's going on in the human brain there. But I guess there are a lot of interesting ideas right now.
Yeah, there's a thing I want to come back to, which is how coarse or how general the inductive biases that we choose should be. And different people obviously have different views on this, and I have shifted myself. I used to be the sort of tabula rasa, like we don't want any inductive bias, but that was wrong. And I started realizing it at that period, thinking about the convolutional architecture. For example, I worked a lot with Yann, and we worked on ConvNets in the 90s. But then even the notion of these distributed representation is introducing some inductive bias, which was missing in the standard statistical methods that only relied on smoothness, for example, which is another inductive bias. So I started realizing the importance of that. Now, there are people who want to go much further and say, okay, we want to solve this problem, so we're going to take all the knowledge we have and try to put it in our machine learning system. And that could be very useful. But there's an advantage of trying to go for the most general inductive bias that you can, that's also as powerful as possible. So there's like a trade-off, because if it's fairly general, these days I think a lot about the sparsity of dependencies in high-level concepts that we manipulate verbally. If it's fairly general like this, it can apply to many, many areas. Right? So then it's sort of more powerful. But if you're, I don't know, a biologist and you want to use machine learning to understand how cells work, it would be crazy not to try to use the knowledge we have already.
Right. I suppose there's definitely a very application dependent thought there.
And also the other factor, which I think Yann was talking a lot about, is we have to be careful with inductive biases. Sometimes we think we know how it should be, but we are wrong. And so we introduce constraints that are wrong. And then we are better off without these constraints, but just collecting more data, which And that recipe has worked incredibly well, of course, in applications where we have lots of data. We just, have very few inductive biases. We have very general machines, lots of data, and we're able to learn really complicated things. Whereas the tradition in AI and machine learning before was quite the other extreme, where we say, well, we try to handcraft everything. In fact, where, at the limit, there is no learning at all.
Right. I guess, of course, there's sort of um, the well-known learning theory that you have to have some kind of bias in
Yes,
place to
but it
learn
doesn't
anything
tell you how
else.
much.
Exactly, exactly. If only we had more sort of quantitative ideas on this. I'd love to move on towards the next section of things here, sort of coming out of that AlexNet moment decade and looking more towards today, what you're thinking about in terms of challenges towards AGI. In response to this question about whether your views have evolved since GPT-3 and the scaling hypothesis, you said you feel you have a much clearer view of how to achieve these goals, but also that you have adopted a Bayesian posture. Could you linger a little bit on your Bayesian posture?
Sure. There's a moment where it became clear. I was having a discussion with some physicists who are using machine learning, and they told me something like, well, it's not good enough for us to have one theory that emerges from our learning system to explain the data we have, because maybe there are other theories that are equally valid to explain the data. And yeah, so and that's the Bayesian posture essentially. The Bayesian posture says we're not going to be satisfied with having the one solution that fits the data, and of course our priors or constraints and so on. Ideally, we want to have all of them. And the reason this is important, and again going back to the use of machine learning in science, imagine I come up with a theory of some aspect of physics, and there's actually another theory that gives very different predictions, at least in some questions of interest to me. I really need to know that, because if I'm going to base my decision on the first theory, well, knowing that it could be completely wrong because there's other theory which is equally possible as an explanation, I might risk people's lives. So it's a question of safety. It's a question of doing the right thing. And that means it's a question of knowing the limits of your knowledge. There are questions for which we just don't have enough information, and we need to quantify that. So people, in the Bayesian world, talk about uncertainty, epistemic uncertainty in particular. So the epistemic uncertainty is the part of our making errors of not knowing that is due to the fact that we don't have enough knowledge. Epistemic, that's knowledge.
Right.
So this is different from our inability to make predictions due to noise, things that are fundamentally unpredictable. So epistemic uncertainty could be reduced if you saw more data and did more of the right experiments. And we need to capture that. And that's not just important for science, but if you build self-driving cars, you need to know that the car isn't sure whether you should go left or right, because maybe somebody's going to die if you don't do the right thing, and you need to wake up the driver or brake or do some conservative action.
There's a lot in what you just said, and one thing I'd love to hone in on a little bit is perhaps the safety and epistemic uncertainty. Perhaps we could even get into the idea of epistemic humility aspects of this.
Yes.
You've said in a few papers recently, this is kind of getting into the consciousness part, which I'd love to delve into a little bit more later. But you've wanted to move from deep statistical models, and I know you're no longer exactly articulating this as system two, but at least in the paper I'm quoting, you said you want to move from these models able to perform system one tasks to deep structural models able to perform system two tasks by taking advantage of the former model's computational workhorse. And this was interesting to me, at least as an articulation. Also, what you just said about safety and the Bayesian posture because when I spoke to Stuart Russell a few weeks ago, he had a lot of thoughts on both of these aspects. One, the sort of moving away from the old model of AI and sort of adopting systems that maintain this type of epistemic humility, but then also to the system one, system two models, at least the way you used to articulate this sort of convergence between the deep learning and the good old fashioned AI communities that he seems to have been predicting for a while.
Right. So there's a lot of topics here. The system two ideas, or high level cognition, as I like to use that term now, it's quite important for, again, very pragmatic reasons, which is the ability to generalize in settings that are a bit different from your training distribution. And I said distribution, not necessarily data. In other words, things have changed. The world is a bit different. You are in a different place. Some agents have done things which really modify the way things happen. What is the optimal thing to do, and so on. And currently, the dominant way of doing things in machine learning, we're not very good at that. Like you train, even these neural nets train on huge quantities of data, you kind of shift to a different distribution, maybe data from one country for training, and then you try it in a different country or something. And you take a big hit, or sometimes changes in the demographics or whatever. But the interesting thing, and the connection to higher level cognition, is that humans are good, or at least better, than current state of the art at these changes. And I'm going to use this example I use all the time. You've been used driving on the right, say, North America for many years, and then you rent a car in London, and you have to drive on the left. And if we were just relying on like system one deep learning, it would take a lot of data of trying to drive in London and maybe killing a bunch of people or getting killed yourself to learn how to drive with this modified rule. But at the end of the day, it's just this one rule that changed. So what's going on with humans when we are in this situation? You pay attention, right? So you can't just go by your habit, and there's something different mode of operation where you remind yourself all the time, oh, I need to pay attention to the driving on the left, and not just follow my impulse. So there's this aspect of self-control where you don't follow your impulse. You allow kind of reasoning and these modified rules or whatever it is that's explaining the change to influence your decisions. So maybe you're going to be clumsy at the beginning, but at least you don't kill anyone and you don't kill yourself. And then you transfer that as you acquire a bit of experience driving on the left. You transfer that, and eventually, maybe after a few days or weeks, it might become a bit more of a habit. So this is a model for what we should do in deep learning. We should have these systems that are able to override the well-practiced, well-trained, not reflexive way of prediction or taking decisions, and can bring in these pieces of knowledge like this rule to and reason about them. Now, what does it mean to reason? And how do humans actually reason? So to understand these things, connecting to the literature in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience is really important. So that's why I think this matters to machine learning. And I also think that we can do it with neural nets. You have neural nets in your head, but with a somewhat different organization when it comes to these higher level cognition aspects. And we know a lot from neuroscience about how it might be going on. There's a theory called the global workspace theory that exists since the 90s, and that's been confirmed in many ways. It's kind of a dominant explanation for what's going on at the high level of cognition. And a lot of my work has been trying to translate that into machine learning terms. What does it mean in terms of algorithms, and why would it be a good thing from the point of view of machine learning and sample complexity? So, for example, one nice property of high-level cognition is that it's able to deal with dependencies between high-level concepts that are very sparse. And that's reflected in natural language. We see a sentence involves very few concepts and still contains lots of useful information. Another interesting aspect of the way we think consciously is the whole causality aspect. And that's also important for the ability to generalize out of distribution. Because what is causality about? Well, there are many ways to discuss this, and listen to hours and hours of lectures, but here's my one-line summary. A causal model is different from a statistical model in that it's really a collection of distributions. So a statistical model is a distribution that we can learn. A causal model is a family of distributions indexed by the interventions you can make in the system. So it contains the answer to, well, if I were to do this, how would that change the distribution? You would have a different distribution. So that's what I mean by index. Like if you tell me what interventions an agent could do, you might get a different distribution. And so the set of all these distributions corresponding to all the possible interventions, that's the causal model. And humans are good at that. I mean, they're not perfect. We make lots of causal errors, but we're pretty good. And children in particular, there's a lot of interesting work about children development, constructing causal understanding, for example, by Alison Gopnik. And that is also a huge source of inspiration. Okay, the Bayesian thing is important here because there may be multiple causal explanations. And if we don't keep track of that in some way, again, we may fail catastrophically. Now, I've never thought that the Bayesian approach was bad, but I didn't really pay attention to it because I thought it was not tractable. That we didn't have algorithms that could work, and maybe there was not any. And I think that's the main reason most people who have good mathematical training kind of disregard the Bayesian ideas, because on paper it is the right thing to do, but you have these intractable quantities that come in. So the good news is I think we can deal with these intractable quantities. We can approximate them, and we can use large neural nets to help us with that. And that's something I'm working on.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into these questions. One thing that stuck out to me in what you were articulating, this is maybe a loose connection of some of these ideas, was this very fascinating interaction between causal graphs and then the idea of attention. When we get introduced to that in machine learning, we have this very elegant mathematical idea of attention over the words in a sentence and that correspondence. But then when we look at the way that humans pay attention, that can happen at so many levels of abstraction. I can pay attention to my left index finger. I can sort of expand that scope of attention to my entire body. And to tie that to causality, say I'm like practicing violin, I want to make my tone sound better, I can intervene on variables in that process, big and small, the vibrato in my fingers, the sort of length of my bow stroke, and things like that, and kind of on the fly figure out what does the causal graph roughly look like here, and sort of learn a lot via that process.
Yeah. There's a whole aspect of machine learning that we didn't talk about, which becomes really important when you start thinking about causality, and that is the action side of things. Because causality, as I defined it, has to do with interventions. Interventions are essentially actions. I mean, they can be actions, but it's a good way to think about it. And so in the last few years, I delved quite a bit in reinforcement learning and started to publish in reinforcement learning. And it's an area that's very popular in machine learning these days, for good reason. I think thinking about the action side as something that mediates these changes in distribution, which is what causality is about, is going to help not just train better agents in tasks where we traditionally would have reinforcement learning, but more generally, even for like computer vision, we need that kind of robustness that we humans have in terms of being able to deal with those shift distribution. So it's funny. Like I feel like a lot of what I'm doing now brings in all these different threads that I may have encountered to some extent in my career before, but I'm digging deeper into. So the Bayesian aspects, the causal aspects. Of course, the neural nets are still there. It's the workhorse, like the machinery that is going to make is going to sample what you think about. So that's where attention comes in. Because there are many variables that you could think about when you observe a scene, and somehow our brain has this internal policy. It's a kind of reinforcement learning, but not for acting outside, acting inside to control your computation. So attention is a kind of computational policy. Where do I put my brain power right now? I want to focus on a few words, as you said. I'll focus on this object, this entity outside that I'm seeing, or this memory, or this thought that I had, this morning. And that's kind of something where the traditional neural nets could be used as the machinery that produces the probability distribution over the actions, which are where you pay attention to. And so, yeah, attention is central to this whole story. And I think there's still a lot that we don't understand. When we introduce attention in our 2014 paper on machine translation, that had a huge impact on machine translation and then natural language processing, we used what we call soft attention, where it's not really that we focus on one word. We actually focus on several ones with a mix, a convex combination. And that's very convenient because we can train with backprop. But it's not the way humans do it. The Necker cube is either one way or the other in your mind. And you have a thought which is about specific entities. It's not a mix of 10 different thoughts. So I do think that we've been using the word attention, but not quite the way that it's happening in the brain. My hypothesis is that in the brain, the attention is more what I call stochastic hard attention. So in order to learn, you want the something that's discrete, like you choose this or that, but not a mix of both, to come with some probability randomly, so that you can get a training signal. Otherwise, there's no way to train, at least in a proper way. And so it feels like there's a bit of randomness in the way our thoughts come. So my hypothesis is that we use a stochastic hard attention mechanism at that high level of consciousness, at least, that we can report.
That's a really interesting way of putting it. I suppose at this point I'd love to segue over into your more recent work on GFlow nets. And you've spoken to some overlaps here, a lot of different ones, because this is sort of combining many different ideas. But when I first read it, one thing that stuck out to me, it felt, I guess I was reminded a little bit of the distributional RL framework. And I know that you've spoken about overlaps between GFlow nets and various ways of doing RL. Could you tell me just a little bit about the overlaps you've kind of thought about there?
Yeah. So you can think of GFlow nets as a particular RL approach where instead of trying to maximize return or rewards, in other words, to find sequences of actions that give you the largest possible value of some objective function, we're trying to sample trajectories, sequences of actions that give rise to end products like states with a probability proportional to the reward you get to get there or when you get there. So there are things that are related in RL, like maximum entropy approaches and soft Q learning and things like this. But there are also some differences. And this is interesting for a number of reasons. One is, well, it's sort of naturally more exploratory, but there is some deeper things. Like if you want to be Bayesian, for example, this is exactly what you need. You want to sample from the posterior distribution of something you care about, some actions or some beliefs or something, conditioned on everything you've seen before, including all the data in your life. Okay, that's what you're trying to do in Bayesian terms. And so you don't want to maximize something like find the parameter that's most probable, but rather sample parameters in proportion to how likely to explain the data you've seen, so that only the configurations of parameters or latent variables or something that are compatible with the data and your prior will be sampled.
Right.
So GFlow-nets are particularly interesting as if you want, special RL methods for sampling from posterior distributions. And that comes up in the Bayesian sense if you want to condition on the data that you've seen before. It also comes up if you have latent variables. So the way I think about the high-level concepts that we think about consciously is that they are chosen by this stochastic hard attention. So there's like some randomness here, and we want to choose them in a way that we can pick from the different interpretations that are compatible with what we've seen, and not just focus on one. If everybody was thinking the same way, we wouldn't have science. So the exploration aspect here is very important. That's why one reason why the first paper on GFlow-nets and then several of the other ones were focused on active learning applications where you need to explore and you need to go and look at the multiple, say, candidate drugs that could work given the information you have, and not just one that fits your reward function.
Yeah, there's a lot to the overlap. Another one that kind of stuck out to me, and that I think you've spoken out about before, was with evolutionary algorithms. And there's perhaps two things that I felt might be relevant, and I kind of wanted to get your sense. There's a very interesting recent paper called Evolution Through Large Models that you might be aware of, and they had this really interesting initial step that sort of bootstrapped a language model, and then eventually we're sort of doing RL at the end, where they kind of bootstrapped the language model into having a set of like diverse samples of Python programs to iterate on via a method like MapElites. And it doesn't seem like that would be something needed in GFlow-nets. It seems like there's, at least in cases like drug discovery, or I'm like adding a molecule to a collection of molecules, a set of actions is already pretty well defined. But I am very curious if there's anything to the combination of this early bootstrapping method via an evolutionary algorithm and the extension of GFlow-nets to maybe a space where the actions are less well defined.
Okay, having less well-defined actions is very important. It's something I've been thinking about quite a bit, but we haven't really cracked that yet. And it's super important because this is more like what we do. It also corresponds to one of the big challenges of reinforcement learning. People like Doina Prikop studied in her thesis in 1999, I think, with options, and later, people call that hierarchical reinforcement learning. In other words, we want to be able to come up with and plan with abstract actions, not the low level like muscle movements, but I'd like to have some tea, and I'll do what I need to do that, and then I'll maybe have a discussion with my friend. So these are abstract goals, and you can plan at that level. They're like meta actions, if you want, and our brain makes them up. They're not real. They're like in our mind. They're invented to help us better control the world, better understand it. And there's nothing, in the GFlowNet framework that says that the actions have to be something that you give meaning to ahead of time. So the math doesn't really prescribe that. Yeah, this is something we're very interested in. And one of the big challenges, we don't know how to solve this problem in RL, and it's clearly something people do, and that has been an inspiration for researchers for over 20 years. And I'm hoping that these new techniques will help there as well. So I think this can be combined with the ideas of System 2, where there's this notion of encapsulation and modularity. Like, knowledge should be broken down into smaller pieces that can be recombined. But these small pieces are abstract. They're not like low-level perception or action. So this is all very related to the higher level cognition and System 2 thinking.
Right. Yeah, it does seem like there's different levels of, I suppose, articulation and well-definedness, and it's really tricky to get our arms around that. There's another overlap here also as evolutionary algorithms where as a future work you suggested investigating how to combine this generative approach with local optimization to refine generated samples while keeping the batch of candidates diverse. And that sounded a lot to me like this idea in evolutionary algorithms of novelty search with local competition. And so I'm curious if you've sort of been taking inspiration from there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in evolutionary methods. Clearly, they have influenced my thinking because, well, natural selection and evolution is something that should be in the background of every scientist. And I saw from the outside the work that happened with genetic algorithms, and then all of that. But so first of all, if you only use mutations, it's a really dumb search. It's a local search, and it suffers from some of the same issues, by the way, that you have with MCMC method, Monte Carlo Markov chain methods, which you do a lot of small local changes, because if you did a big change, it will probably lead to nowhere, like something bad. And so you can only do like small changes to hope that it still works, that you might get something better. Um, and when So the thing that's really interesting about evolutionary methods is not the mutations, it's the crossover, and because it allows a kind of generalization at a distance. Like you take two things that worked well and you combine them. But it's done in a way that I think is not nearly as powerful as what you could do with machine learning, where you can have all kinds of powerful forms of generalization. So the reason why GFlowNets and potentially other methods that are related to variational methods in machine learning can do better than MCMC is because in order to guess what good choices, good configurations might be, you're not limited to these local moves. You can use the power of generalization. So what does that mean? If you've seen a few configurations that worked well, you might be able to find a pattern so that you can guess something that's far away but follows that pattern would be a good answer.
Right.
And that's really what allows to do potentially exponentially better than things like just mutation-based evolutionary methods or MCMC methods.
Right. The GFlowNets idea also seems to be something like a very general framework. I know you had a very recent paper, I think just a little over a week ago, perhaps. I was also looking at different types of generative models and then sort of articulating them as like specific versions of what a GFlowNet is more broadly, which was interesting.
Yeah, the whole spectrum of unsupervised learning and generative models is quite interesting as a space. There are many connections between different methods. It turns out GFlowNets has flavors and as kind of special cases, many of existing methods, but also brings its own flavor, and the flavor is very much related to the inspiration from high level cognition. In other words, we build these data structures in our mind that explain what we're seeing or maybe constitute plans. And so it has this like discrete sequential aspect of System 2, which you don't typically find in other unsupervised generative models.
If you have time for one more question on this topic, there was something really interesting you said in another interview discussing the consciousness prior in GFlowNets, in which you stated that you felt Cartesian dualism was an illusion. And I know you posed this as a question for David Chalmers. If I'd seen that interview before speaking to him, I would have tried to ask him about it as well. But just turning that question back to you, could you expand a little bit on just your thoughts on that dualist theory of consciousness?
Right. So Descartes had the intuition that within us we had these really two different things, the body and the mind. And actually we all, I mean, most of us get that impression. And I think it's also behind a lot of the mental pictures that are associated with most religions and superstitions and supernatural things that our brain tends to make up quite easily. Now, the biological reality, of course, Descartes didn't know. This is way, before neuroscience matured as it is today. The reality of biology is there is no such thing as that separation. We have this, where, I mean, to the extent that what we know, of course, because there's still a lot we don't know, but the consensus is there is no such separation, of course. But we still have to explain why we have that feeling that there is something special about being me, and that I control things. So that's like the free will illusion, maybe, and that there's a difference between what may be going on in our brain that makes us do things and the conscious perception we have, subjective aspects of this that we can report sometimes verbally, but we can't completely explain with words. And so what I like is the stance from people like Dan Dennett, who's a philosopher of consciousness, but also people like neuroscientists like Michael Graziano, who are asking more the question of what is going on physically in our brain that gives us that impression that there is this separation between the me that controls, the me that perceives, and what is going on, more like at a lower level, this mind-body separation. And Graziano has some nice theories about this, which I find compelling. But of course, we need a lot more investigation. But that's the scientific way to deal with this, which is not just take for granted that because we feel that there is that separation, that it exists. It's just, this is how we feel, but it doesn't mean it's the reality. We may feel that, there is God that's helping us out there. It doesn't mean it's true, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same thing.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting ideas there, and I guess to the dualism idea, even before looking at today's science, I think there's a pretty interesting objection directly to Descartes from the Princess Elizabeth, where she's like, well, you have a body that is extended, a brain that is not extended. How can there be a causal arrow from brain to body? Which I think was a pretty early and still somewhat salient objection that I don't think Descartes ever totally responded to. And with the whole free will illusion too, I think that there are some later ideas from Kant where he's like, well, you can't exactly have free will, but the mind, cognition, almost has to imagine that it has free will in order to act in the world, which is really interesting. I think just as a different frame of the take, I suppose.
Well, free will also has a social role. Right. So if we think of ourselves as machines, even stochastic machines, then the notion of social responsibility, like even legal responsibility, seems weird because people just, the machine does what it does. But if we think of us as agents, which is of course a kind of illusion, because we're not free will agents. Well, we just follow our policy, which may be stochastic, but still it's just a policy. That's a mechanical thing. If we didn't have this notion of free will, it would be strange to blame someone who's made something bad. But now here's the thing: we are humans, or even animals, and we can learn. And then it makes sense to blame somebody and to maybe punish them. Besides the fact that we want to protect society, but just because that will teach them and others that these are things you shouldn't do. So with the illusion that this person could have acted differently, which of course is wrong, they acted as they had to, but that illusion is useful for what we call credit assignments in machine learning, because it helps provide a signal. There's actually a causal counterfactual here, which is if you had acted differently, things would have been better. And so now I can use this in order to change my policy. So in the future, I will not do it. Or someone else could use that as an example to avoid doing that mistake.
Right, right. The determinism and blame assignment question is really interesting. There's a very interesting paper, Determinism al dente, which sort of tries to toe the line between maintaining a fairly hard determinist stance, but then also reserving room for actually blaming people, which I thought was very interesting.
It's not just a question of determinism, because we are probably stochastic machines as well.
Right, right.
And there are like technical reasons why we are, I think, but it doesn't change the bottom line. Even if it's a stochastic machine, it still follows some causal process, and you can't, like, it doesn't make sense to blame it, except if you think, oh, this could be useful information in order to change the policy so that in the future you wouldn't do those mistakes. So now free will, like this illusion of free will, is useful. Like the fact that I think I could have done differently, which is wrong, may be a useful signal for me.
Yeah, it's a very useful signal. And to what you said about the stochastic side of things, I suppose this sort of has to do with why when people will make arguments like, "Oh, quantum mechanics exists, therefore free will," that doesn't totally work like that.
No, free will is not randomness. It's not about random choices.
Exactly.
It's not clear what free will is, but it's something we have in our mind, clearly. And it's like the dualism. It's something that we have in our mind that's maybe a useful illusion to some extent, or a side effect of something useful. But we need to, instead of taking it for granted and then trying to see where we go from there, we need to study it as a phenomenon. Like, why do we think this way? Why do we have this impression? Why does it make sense? How does it arise? How does it serve us or hurt us?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of these impressions are certainly adaptive, just in terms of our action as like beings on our own, but then also, as you've said multiple times, socially. I think there's a much deeper rabbit hole we could go into on this, but perhaps I'd just like to pivot towards a last set of questions if there's time. And this is more kind of on some personal perspectives on just you as a researcher and the work you've done. My first is there's a very good talk you've probably read by Richard Hamming, you and your research. And he had a lot of interesting takes here, but one particular quotation that he says is, when you're famous, it is hard to work on hard problems. And looking at your work, this is not a problem I perceive you as having, but I'm just curious how those words strike you in terms of his perspective on, he has a lot to say about people who've won Nobel Prizes and sort of what happens after that. And so I'm sort of curious how you in that position look on those words.
The best is to not pay attention to all that fame and recognition too much, so that you can be as free as possible. and doing what you think is right, which means taking risks, making mistakes, and following your scientific instinct, and just like you would have done before. So that requires exercise and humility, which may be difficult if you receive a lot of these marks of recognition, but I think it's essential. Humility is also important for another reason, which is, as a scientist, it's very important not to trust your intuition completely. It's good to follow your intuition, but you should also be aware that it could be wrong. And if you're not humble enough, you could fool yourself, and that's not good.
I suppose so. Yeah, there's again the epistemic humility, and I think the Bayesian posture strikes again. My last question, I guess, is a little bit of a different take. So, having read a bit about your background, I saw that you have a very interesting family background. Your father being a pharmacist who wrote theater pieces, ran a theatrical troupe, and then your mother was also an artist. Has art played a significant role in your own life? And I'm curious how their backgrounds impacted you as a person, and if you felt they've impacted you as a researcher.
They have impacted me to this in the sense that my parents gave me a lot of freedom of being whatever I wanted and exploring, um, and not feeling that I was blocked in some constraints and rules that most children feel maybe sometimes in their family. Because art is also like science, about exploration. It's a wilder kind of exploration where things are even less constrained than in science, because you don't need to be fully coherent. And yeah, so that's influenced me quite a bit. It also, related to this, it has given me respect for people who think differently from me, because in art, of course, there are many art forms and different ways of doing things, and every artist is original. And that doesn't mean, it's not like you don't need to be right in art. It just needs to be interesting. And I think in science, of course, we need to seek truth. But as we said, there could be multiple theories that seem to fit the bill, and it is important to explore them. But we need that freedom. So yeah, this is the biggest gift I got. And of course, the gift of being interested by the intellect, that's intelligence, but I mean more generally, like abstractions and science and understanding. One of my motto is like, understand. Try to understand. I want to understand. Why? What's going on?
Yeah, there do certainly seem to be a lot of interesting overlaps with the way our brains go about exploring and thinking about things between art and science. And it does seem like there are so many great scientists for whom art is also a really important part of their lives, or inspires them in some way or another. Well, Professor Benzio, I do want to thank you again for everything you've done for this field, for sitting down and talking with me today. It was really an honor to have you on.
My pleasure. Thanks for your questions.
And that is a wrap, my friends. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, you can subscribe to The Gradient on Substack to receive not just this podcast, but also our articles and newsletters directly to your email. You can also visit us at thegradient.pub, where you'll find all of that, as well as more information about The Gradient and how you could even contribute if you're interested. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, we would really appreciate your feedback. If you'd like to leave a comment or review, we'd love to know how we can make this series more interesting and informative to you. And with all that, I'll leave you until the next episode.